Welcome back to Guess in the Mecca. I'm your host Master, and in today's episode, we are taking a look back at Wonder Egg Priority. As you know, this is an anime that I really like, and I have made that clear through multiple episodes on this podcast. But today I want to do something a bit different, and that is giving a bit of a retrospective on Wonder Egg, and that's mainly because I think the discourse on this show has changed quite a lot, particularly after the ending, and I think we also are in a nice position since the ending has come, so we can talk about it as a complete piece as opposed to the episodes so far. So let's just dive into today's episodes. No new reviews for this week, but if you of course do want to leave a review, you can do so by going to the link in the description. But anyway, let's get into the episode for this week. That is episode 99 of Guess in the Mecca. We're getting close. Episode 99 of the show. A look into Wonder Egg Priority. So this is a bit of a mini retrospective. Before we dive into this episode, I'm sure I put it in the previous section for opening the video, but I should establish for audio listeners as well that there will be spoilers for Wonder Egg Priority. Obviously, this is a retrospective. I'm looking on it kind of after giving it a bit of a breather for about a month, so I'm going to talk about what happens in this show, as you might expect. I think opinions on this show have changed quite drastically since the special episode aired about a month ago. Over that time, I've been thinking quite deeply about this series and how I feel about it and how I connect to it, and I've kind of come to the conclusion, and this might spoil a bit of the fun of this episode, even though you can probably tell in the title of this podcast that I still love it, I still enjoy it, this is still one of my favorite anime. After I've allowed myself to think about it more freely, I've watched some other anime, I've looked at other things. Overall, I've just had other experiences and time out of Wonder Egg, and now looking back at it, I still have the same feelings for it, and that's what I'm going to try and address today. I think there are a lot less voices now versus what there were about a month ago, and so that's allowed me to think more clearly about my own personal opinion about this anime and the ending of the anime. And that's really how I came to that conclusion that I still really enjoy it. The discourse was quite messy then, but after thinking about it in isolation, it's been quite refreshing because all those feelings and all that nostalgia, there's not really much nostalgia, but it's only been a month or so, but all those feelings managed to come back. Also, since we're nearing the very end of this season of Guess in the Mecca, even though I'm going to continue season 2 like it was on the weekly schedule, but we are reaching the end of this season, and even so, I feel like this would be a good time to end this Wonder Egg chapter, and it's likely not the last time I'm ever going to mention it at all, but this might be the last real deep dive into Wonder Egg for a while, if not ever, because I don't know how long this property is going to go on for. This might be it, and so I kind of just want to put my final opinion here in one place before whatever happens in the future. For me, Wonder Egg Priority has been an unforgettable experience, not really because and not just because of what it addresses, but the experience of watching it in itself was, again, quite unforgettable for me. I think the experience of watching it is just as important as how you feel when you're actually watching it, and in this case, I really had a good time watching it on the weekly basis. Waiting and watching week by week for 11 weeks and seeing this girl that originally was quite isolated and quite insular, maybe even reclusive, and then seeing her find friends and slowly see her own problems unfold, and then seeing her address those problems was really magical, honestly, and a feeling that I only really think can be obtained through the week by week original experience and how it aired when it did. Yes, you can watch Wonder Egg and still enjoy it, and I don't want to hinder anyone's enjoyment and say you're not allowed to enjoy it. Of course you are, but I think the experience would never quite be the same versus if you watched it when it was airing, very much like loads of other anime that aired that I didn't watch, for example. I think there's something powerful about seeing progress in film or TV, and the anime community has definitely latched onto it. We often talk about character development, I'd say more so on the battle shonen side, but character development is a massive thing that I think that word's been rinsed out very far, but I think it goes to show how much development and progress means to anime viewers. And I'm not gonna lie, in the case of Wonder Egg, I think I fell for that spell. I was under that spell, and it really had an impact on me seeing Ai and Momo and Neiru and Rika all just kind of not really transform their lives, but move on with their lives. And that's something that I'm not going to be able to forget. This attachment to the characters only grows during the appointment viewing experience, and it's a lot like checking in on a friend every week to see how they're doing and see and get up to their progress. Obviously, it's a bit more action-packed and dramatic than that, but watching someone have tough times, seeing them have great times, seeing them have really awful times, and seeing them have some of the best times in their life is really magical, and being able to see it unfold for yourself week by week again is something that's quite powerful. This is kind of bleeding into topics on the actual show itself and what it's about, and I think it's a good time to get into that. I think the characters feel so human, and I'm sure you could tell the way I was describing them and checking in on them, I treated them like real people living real lives, because yes, animation does have that sort of detachment where you're like, okay, this isn't real, and it's easier to suss out. There's a bit of detachment, I think, sometimes, but in this case, I really got consumed. Obviously, I can tell the difference between fiction and reality, and that's something that I think everyone should do, not just for the purpose of enjoyment, but also just for your own safety as well. Being able to tell the difference between the two is incredibly important. But I mean, in terms of immersion and such, I was fully in. These girls were my friends. They really meant a lot to me, and that was really tough seeing them go through each episode and each week with their struggles. And I think that says a lot about how human they feel and how human they're kind of written in a lot of ways. We can also go into stuff like character acting and how they're animated and so many other dimensions. But I mean, overall, I think Wonder Egg taps into what makes people human and all the uncomfortable things that also make them human too. A lot of the messages in the show just resonate with me quite a lot, even if not directly. There are things in the show which I honestly haven't struggled with, and I wouldn't lie to say that I have, but I think that you can indirectly feel a lot of the troubles which they go through, just being a person who's gone through adolescence themselves. I think it's something that we can all relate to, and just by virtue of having a youth, it's something that's pretty relatable in a way, and I felt that a lot of the time. As you can tell by me saying I was immersed, I was in it. I remembered those things that I also went through as well. Wonder Egg priority, in my view, says that we need to keep on fighting. To keep on fighting isn't just to help out others and find closure for them, but to find closure for ourselves as well. Something that's quite interesting about the show is that, and I think this is something that also happens a lot in narratives that are centered around heroes, even though, yeah, you can call the girls in Wonder Egg heroes, even if they're not, I'm not talking about being superheroes or something, but often when narrative centers focus on helping other people, we often forget ourselves in the process. But Wonder Egg conceptually is quite smart because it's about by helping other people, we also learn a lot about ourselves. We kind of go back to a message that we spoke about in the Odd Taxi podcast last week, in how we are all connected and our decisions and actions and identity don't live in vacuums. They don't live by themselves, but in fact they are part of something much bigger. And Wonder Egg teaches us kind of a similar thing in a more subtle way. Wonder Egg definitely runs home the message on acknowledging our flaws and recognizing our own battles, but also liberating ourselves from the weight of those troubles which we go through. And this is done, of course, through the Wonder Eggs, which are kind of these mini thought experiment bubble type things where we're tasked with liberating a girl from said trouble in which manifests within that, whether it's metaphorical, created in their mind, or quite literal and physical. This reminds me of something from Neon Genesis Evangelion. Yes, mandatory Evangelion plug in this episode. And it's where, even though we are fighting angels and we're not particularly fighting humans or so, we learn a lot about the human existence each and every time we go through the sort of cycle of fighting another angel. A lot of the way we learn about ourselves is by learning with other people, learning through other people. And that's kind of the, I want to say, iceberg type style of Wonder Egg, where similarly to how, and something we discussed in a former episode, and how Wonder Egg seeps eventually into what it means to be human and what it means to be an adolescent after tackling these social issues and the issues which these very specific girls face, it then develops into much further and goes into the almost philosophical origin of them. When we look at the individual stories of the girls, it's a very similar matter where we look at initially the problems of other people. It's kind of like we go into each Wonder Egg and we're telling the story of someone else in a way, a bit vaguely, but still in a way looking at their story. But as we go along, we learn that their story, or the girls' stories, are reflected through them. And we eventually, episode 12 is kind of the logical conclusion of that, where Ai sees a version of herself in which did unfortunately lose her life. And it gets pretty deep in that regard. That's what I'm going to try and say. I'm not going to dive into all the narrative elements in this episode because we could be here for a long time. Some of them deserve the entire own episode, but I think there's still a lot we can speak about, and I think Wonder Egg is rich with these philosophical ideas, and also the way in which it's structured allows this to happen too, by slowly getting deeper and deeper and deeper until we get to the core, or the center, which is looking at themselves and looking at adolescence as an idea. This wouldn't be an episode of Guess in the Mecha if we didn't talk about direction, and so let's do a bit of that. On the direction side of things, I think Wonder Egg has to be, in all honesty, one of the best things I've seen in a really long time. It is very special to me. On the whole, I think Wakabayashi just nails dipping between these two feelings of, or not feelings, but perhaps ideas of order and disorder. We see this not just in his episodes, but in the entire show, always keeping us on edge, and it just slowly slips into something darker. We see it in episode 11, we see it in episode 12, we see it in episode 1, almost every episode in the series. It's easy to be distracted by Wonder Egg's rather optimistic and bright-looking aesthetic, but it's able to sink its teeth into these quite harsh and deeper topics very easily and quite seamlessly on the visual front. Episode 1, storyboarded of course by Shin Wakabayashi, series director himself, features a lot of these moments like the conversation between Ai and Koito on the staircase, which eventually switches into Ai entering this more distressed mood, and it's able to again just slip into these very easily. I don't really know how to explain how it does it. It kind of just does, and I think this is maybe something, I think the fact that it doesn't draw too much attention to it is how it does so well. Reminds me of something that Kai Karashi did on his episodes of Dynazenon, again, mandatory Dynazenon plug, in how a lot of the cuts between certain moments aren't over dramatized. In fact, it kind of just cuts, almost like how if you were to cut something on camera, there isn't this fancy transition between the two. There's nothing to break it up, and it feels incredibly natural and seamless. I think the best way to make a seamless transition is not to try too hard, and I think that's exactly what Wakabayashi does in the show as well. This one's perhaps a bit more dramatic, but when you see Ai discovering the door to the school roof and she's slowly wading through, again, it's much more dramatic, but I love how it transitions her into the past, and that's something this show is so effective at doing. Past and present are blurred so easily, and I think that does really well for the notion of nostalgia. which it talks about. The fact that we are embedded in our pasts, and our pasts, yes, we say they don't define us, and Wonder Egg says that they shouldn't define us, but in a lot of ways we are attached to them. We can't really get rid of them and shake them off. And the way Wakabayashi is able to blur the two together so easily just shows how strong and well thought out this concept is. The same kind of applies to debut director and storyboard artist Yuki Onomori, who storyboards episodes 3 and 12, two of the most magnificent episodes of this year, 2021, that is. And two of my favorite episodes of the series, and maybe even anime. Maybe not but very, very great episodes. The way Yonemori is able to handle a lot of the storytelling through binaries is so impressive. And their episode 3 kind of feels like a prequel to episode 12, which does a very similar thing. Again, this kind of lets it slip through these different themes very effectively. These binary opposites like dark and light and day and night in episode 12 to show that parallel not just between Ai and Koito or Ai and Saoki, but also, so it's like you have multiple layers of binaries here. Not just Ai and Saoki and Ai and Koito, but Ai and herself, the version of herself that is unfortunately on the verge of death. And the version of her which perhaps is much more hopeful. It's incredibly complex. Same goes for these other parallels as well between Ai and Koito, with the whole wet and dry thing when she eventually comes out of the pool, and it's kind of like, it speaks a lot to how Ai has done all these things for Koito for her own sake, and also feels like she hasn't been compensated. But then we eventually get to the conclusion of the episode, which kind of states that it's the fact that she's a friend and the fact that she's there for her, which is enough. It's not really about all the things we've done for each other that matters. And again, it goes back to liberating ourselves from the past. This theme underpins so much of Wonder Egg, even on the visual level. But even if we move away from the visual stuff, on the musical level, this still applies. When we look at the electronic and ultimately quite modern tracks counterbalancing the more traditional and almost romantic sounding tracks, they sound like they're in a fairground or something. They have very two contrasting ideas of adolescence, one which is much more rebellious and out there and perhaps you could say liberal, I say in quotation marks, I don't mean it politically, and then you have the much more traditional and again romantic view. It's past and present that's always clashing against each other. These binaries run so deep into Wonder Egg, and I feel like that goes right to the very end. It's something that I'm not going to be able to forget and pass up, despite it maybe not ending the way in which I wish it did. But it's an incredible example of how to build and layer a theme throughout these episodes. And it's an absolute masterpiece in that regard. Things like the debut of Yuki Onomori, or the debut of a lot of younger animators, for example, or even the Shin Wakabayashi's probably second big work after 22/7. This is something that I'm not going to be able to forget and just pass up as if it didn't happen. This is, I think, Wonder Egg, at least from the caliber of work that is put into it, I think is honestly, it's a big achievement, and I think it would perhaps be a bit ignorant of me to act and throw away my feelings as if I wasn't incredibly impressed by all the work that was put into it despite the ending. Speaking of the ending, let's open Pandora's box a bit and talk about, let's have ending discourse. Endings have been a bit of a saucy topic as of late, particularly considering that Attack on Titan ended recently, the manga that is, and that caused a big storm and a lot of debates on does a quote unquote bad ending, or even though my opinion on Wonder Egg won't really suggest it's a bad ending, but does a quote unquote bad ending mean it's bad overall? And that is something very interesting that perhaps I won't dive into as much. And luckily, the Wonder Egg ending discourse has been a lot more civil, so it's been a lot more tame, so I'm also going to keep it tame. I'm not going to run out with any flashy statements here, but let's talk about endings now. Regarding the ending, and I don't really want to roll in it too much, but despite its more awkward ending that surrounds itself on probably what is the weakest element of the show, being the whole relationship with Nehru and such, and Nehru kind of not saying not being human, but kind of feeling detached from her humanity and being obsessed with logic and facts and such, and then being consumed by thrill at the end. It's unfortunate that it built itself on that. I personally wouldn't have done that, but I'm not a writer, so I don't know what works and what doesn't. It's not an awful plot point that it brings up. This is kind of the narrative which it sets in episode 9. But episode 9, out of all of the series, is probably one of the weakest episodes, and it's a bit unfortunate that it tries to build on something that is perhaps it doesn't have a super strong foundation. I'm really struggling to say this because that episode is it's also probably the most complicated one as well to really understand what's going on. And yeah, it is a bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. Let's dive into it a bit more, at least. Let's dive a bit into the ending a bit more. When we return to the gacha machine and Nehru is taken away, for me, it said a lot about the price in which we have to pay for this experience. I go back to the words of Ura and Aka at the very beginning of the series in the form of a firefly when they mentioned that there's always something we want. There is always something we desire. They didn't say that part, but it's something there's something we will push for, even if we deny it and shut it off. There's something we always regret we didn't do, but we have a chance, I guess in the case of the Wonder Eggs, to try and recuperate for that and do something. But we have to remember that's kind of what it means to be a human and to be adolescent. It's to always want something more and to be more than we already are. What I think is really important about the ending, and a detail that I don't think was discussed very much, is the way Ai kind of returns to the gacha machine with very little hesitation. Those bonds and lessons on learning from your past and such, and liberating yourself from your past as well, are things that she didn't forget. It was an experience that did not go to waste. Once we accept that we'll never truly be fulfilled and completely fulfilled, once we're able to accept that we aren't the ideal and perfect person and teenager or adolescent, life becomes a lot easier. And I think that throughout the series, the reason why the ending didn't really hurt me, and yes, I know it ends kind of on a cliffhanger, but the reason why it didn't is, okay, one, because I'm not gonna lie, it ended on it utilized the plot point that was probably the most vague and weakest one of the show. Not a bad one, but perhaps the weakest one in comparison to the rest of it. And secondly, I feel like it's because the show did so much hard work throughout it to give these girls kind of a conclusion in a way. Almost all of them had somewhat of a conclusion in which they were able to address their past and come to terms with it and liberate themselves from it in a way, and understand that, yeah, they're not going to be the ideal, they're not going to be perfect. When we have Rika and her parents and such, and her own problems, as well as Ai with Sawaki and so on, and her discerning between what love really means and getting to understand that. When we also look at Momo as well and her identity, all of these things were able to be somewhat fixed in a way. I say that also in quotation marks, but the fact that they were able to do that throughout the show means that I personally think that it kind of shielded itself. It sheltered itself from the impact of that ending, which, yes, it does stir things up a bit, and it makes things, perhaps it does undermine the rest of it to an extent, but I also don't think that I think the extent is overstated by a lot of people, and that's why I mostly disagree that the ending is awful and it ruined the entire show. I simply can't believe that, in my opinion. What wasn't really concluded was the Frill saga and the stuff with Eros and such, which I really wanted to see, honestly. And even though I think it's incredibly important, I still think that stuff like episode 11 is a beautiful standalone episode for introducing the Death Drive and how we are all somewhat attached to it and extremely vulnerable to it in adolescence. In short, the so-called damage that was done from the ending was kind of mitigated in the former episodes to me, to the point to which I didn't really feel almost betrayed by what happened. I felt betrayed too strong of a word, but I definitely didn't feel too upset ending it. If anything, I was more upset that Wonder Egg is ending, because this is one of my favorite shows. Let me just condense my overall thoughts on Wonder Egg and put that with the ending in mind as well. Now we have the opportunity to talk about it. In my honest opinion, I think Wonder Egg made it clear to me that you can kind of not accept everything or love everything about something or a piece of media and still really enjoy it and still really love it. And I already knew this, but I feel like I really had to do it for the first time properly in the case of this show. It sounds a bit weird, but once you release yourself from these imaginary shackles and this arbitrary idea that you must like every dimension of something that you claim to like, I think liking the media becomes a lot easier, and you don't have to feel so-called... I'm not trying to guilt anyone into liking Wonder Egg here, don't get me wrong. If you don't like it because of the ending, that's totally fine too. You are fully in your right to do so, but I feel like there will be probably someone out there that thinks that they're not really allowed to like it overall because they didn't like the ending. And to you, I say it's okay to do that. There's nothing wrong with what you're doing there. There's not a rule. We've created these things. I won't dive into everything I so-called dislike about Wonder Egg, but I think there are genuinely things that could be done very differently. Episode 10 comes to mind and how the themes in that were handled. Episode 2, I think, also comes to mind as well. There are things in the show that I think aren't handled with enough care, and I mean this more on the written level more so than I mean on the visual level. The visual level, I'm pretty damn happy, as you can tell, but this show has issues. I agree, and I think part of it is thinking about those issues and how they apply to our real world and societies, but also just it's fine to acknowledge them and still enjoy the thing. That's something that I think a lot of the community has perhaps struggled with over the past few months with stuff like the KyoAni stuff and other things too. I honestly still think Wonder Egg is a really great achievement from the perspective of storytelling and direction on the part of Wakabayashi and his team, and I just simply can't dismiss Wonder Egg as another anime because of how it ended, even though, of course, I didn't love the ending, but it's more so that I feel like it could have been done better with obviously more time and the production circumstance. This could have been great, and unfortunately it isn't. I'm very, very much like Wonder Egg, I'm holding on to the past. I'm thinking of a potential future that didn't happen, but overall I'm still incredibly happy with it. And I think everyone that worked on it did almost everything they could to deliver a great anime, but it unfortunately didn't come out the way it could have, or the way they perhaps wanted to, which is unfortunate, but that's unfortunately how things go. All these themes on adolescence and the urge for self-destruction and overcoming our own problems are things that still deeply resonate with me. I would be lying to myself if I was trying to purge my feelings and suggest that, no, I can't like this anymore. Like, there's this objective rule that you can't like something because you didn't like a certain element of it. That is, to me, how the media is. We base our opinions based on feelings, based on thoughts, and genuine words and ideas. And those ideas aren't ones that simply faded away. And I've repeated this point over and over again, but I'm still attached to this show. And I don't think attachment to characters and ideas just die that quickly. All those times that I cried watching clips of this show and watching certain episodes of it and being in pure shock all of the time are still in my heart and things that I can't shut off, regardless of whether the ending undermined it or not. I'd love to see this property get more love in the future, and even if it doesn't, I'm still so proud of it. I'd love to see something like The Adolescence of Utena or even Galeon Death and Rebirth, or something of that style anyway. Even though it's unlikely, I still think there's a bit of a glimmer of hope, which is exactly what this anime tells us, to continue to strive for liberating yourself from the past. With that being said, that is the episode for this week. If you did enjoy it, it would be lovely if you showed your appreciation and left a review on Apple Podcasts. The link is in the description. And also if you commented, liked, subscribed, those YouTuber things, that also help out a ton as well. Next week is, I'm just going to say it right now, we're going to do a 2-part episode, or it's going to be 2 weeks, 2 episodes. The end of Evangelion. I finally need to rewatch the movie and I'm gonna talk about it. It's been highly requested and it's something that I really want to get out of the way now because I think I'm really ready to discuss it. One of my favorite movies of all time and a kind of scary movie to me, to be honest, but we'll talk about that, of course, when the occasion comes next week. So thank you for listening. I will see you on the End of Evangelion podcast on episode 100 of Get in the Mecha. Thank you for listening. The music in this production goes as follows: Mandatory Overtime by Joth and Synthwave by Alex McCulloch.